As Joe Biden reaches the end of his time in office, there have been, of course, a lot of discussion about pardons, ones he has already given, like to his son, and we had a whole new raft of pardons that I'll get into momentarily, but also a question of whether or not he should and whether he will issue preemptive pardons for people who may be threatened by retribution from Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders weighed in on this question and said he was in favor of pardons for members of the January 6th committee. Let's take a listen to that.
We know the White House is considering potential preemptive pardons of those who've clashed with President-elect Trump. In light of what the president-elect said to me, that yes, he does think that members of the January 6th committee should go to jail, do you think that Mr. Biden should issue preemptive pardons for the entire January 6th committee?
Well, I think he might want to consider that very seriously. Look, that is an outrageous statement. This is what authoritarianism is all about. It's what dictatorship is all about. You do not arrest elected officials who disagree with you, who undertake an investigation. So all of us, and I would tell you, Krystal, I think there are a lot of Republicans. You just heard Lindsey Graham make that statement. I think that idea of Trump is not going to go very far. It is so quite outrageous.
So kind of interesting. He, on the one hand, says, like, yes, I think he should consider that. On the other hand, he says, I don't think a lot of these ideas are going to go very far. Do you have any reaction to this? We can move on to the...
I just think it's kind of cringe. But, I mean, like, look, maybe it will happen, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, like you said, I find it genuinely unbelievable. It also just gets to the Biden theory of pardons, of which I've been thinking about, which you also floated. Look, I don't agree with pardoning people on the death penalty, but I understand the, like, moral and philosophical case. But considering that his people who've been pardoned so far are his son and then a bunch of crooks who we're about to get to, people who should rot in hell for the rest of their lives, while probably what most people would consider like nonviolent offenses or whatever, or people genuinely deserving of clemency, especially if you're a Democrat, if you're a leftist, or you said you're going to pardon all these people and you allow those people, you know, to continue to be in prison. I'm just very interested that elected lawmakers are the ones under consideration. My son is the very first person I pardon is my son. Then I will follow with commutations.
That was kind of wild.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, oh, so we're worried about the elected officials, the sons, and corrupt judges, but not others. Now, look, I'm not a leniency person in general, but if that's your framework, you got to see a lot of corruption here. So that's what I would say to Bernie Sanders.
So I think it makes sense, given the threats against like people who were just on the January 6th committee, whatever. I think it's reasonable to issue preemptive pardons there. But let's go ahead and talk about what Biden has actually done already, because it is kind of wild. Let's put this up on the screen. So he issued a raft of some 1,500 historic clemency package for 1,500 convicted criminals who the White House said, quote, deserve a second chance. Most of these commutations were for people who had been released during COVID. There was an effort, this was actually under Donald Trump, to alleviate some of the pressure on federal prisons and help stop the spread, which was really, quite significant within the prison system. So people who were nonviolent, who I think were towards the end of their terms, were sent home to some sort of home imprisonment. And these 1,500 people were part of that program. And apparently, in this mix of 1,500 people, one of the individuals who was pardoned is just one of the most despicable criminals you can possibly imagine. This judge who was in cahoots with the builders of these private juvenile detention facilities that was part of a scheme to sentence kids as young as like 8 years old to juvenile detention, several of whom ultimately committed suicide in these facilities because the conditions were so horrible and their lives were so horrible and so tortured. They called this man, I remember covering this case. It was the Kids for Cash was what they called him, and there was another judge that was in cahoots with him. And he was one of the people that was pardoned as part of this. The headline here from CNN, they say victims of major public corruption cases in Pennsylvania and Illinois are angry. President Joe Biden granted clemency this week to 2 convicted officials. So in addition to this crooked Pennsylvania judge, there was also what they describe as a notorious Illinois fraudster who had been convicted. Rita Crundwell is her name. She had been convicted of a $54 million embezzlement scheme, believed to be the largest municipal fraud in U.S. history. But just so you understand like how horrific this was, the situation with the judge, his partner in crime like I said, ordered children as young as 8 to juvenile detention. Many of them first-time offenders would be for things like petty theft, jaywalking, truancy, smoking on school grounds, other minor infractions. The judge often ordered youths he had found delinquent to be immediately shackled, handcuffed, taken away without giving them a chance to put up a defense or even say goodbye to their families. The mother of one of these children who died by suicide after spending time in one of these facilities said she was shocked and hurt after learning of Biden's decision to commute the rest of Conahan's sentence. And to your point, Saagar, think of some of the people whose sentences you could commute. I mean, Joe Biden claims to be against the death penalty. You have a significant number of federal inmates on death row. He could commute their sentences to life in prison. Hasn't done that. Let's put this up on the screen. You have Leonard Peltier, who was convicted. He's a Native American activist who was convicted in the 70s, has been in prison for 44 years, is elderly. The original conviction would not hold up to scrutiny today. There was basically no evidence that he committed the crime that they accused him of committing. No sign that he's planning to pardon Leonard Peltier. The pressure continues, and members of Congress have been pushing him to go in this direction. Next one up on the screen. Julian Assange, not in prison anymore, but he is still being urged to also pardon Assange and clear him of his charges to send a message on media freedom. Jim McGovern, a Democrat from Massachusetts, and Thomas Massie, a Libertarian Republican from Kentucky, they both wrote to the president with a bipartisan request to pardon Julian Assange earlier in November. Another one up on the screen, someone we've had on this show, Stephen Donziger, who stood up to Chevron and was prosecuted and persecuted for doing such. There are 34 members of Congress who are calling on Joe Biden to pardon Stephen Donziger. He was jailed directly by Chevron lawyers. Many experts call it the nation's first corporate prosecution. And again, he, prioritized pardoning his own son and pardoning this crooked, horrible judge, Kids for Cash judge, over any of these much more deserving and wrongfully imprisoned individuals.
Yeah. Look, I mean, again, presidential pardon is crazy. And it's funny that whenever they get to use it, 9 out of 10 times, they do what their monarchical predecessors always did, which is pardon their friends and oligarchical allies. Eventually, they will throw some crumbs or whatever to the people with a few things like this. But the Cash for Kids one just makes no sense. And look,
I think what happened is they just didn't look into it. They were just mass pardons for all these people.
No, but because remember, under Trump, they had this whole, there's no pardons process and all of this. They have a process. There is no way a pardon gets to the President of the United States desk under this administration where they were not aware, at least somewhat.
I think incompetence is very likely.
Maybe incompetence, but what's the alternative?
Zients, as chief of staff, has been an utter disaster. And so it would not surprise me. And obviously, Joe Biden's brain is cooked. Like, he's not looking into
So he's just signing whatever?
Yeah, I mean, whether it's whether it's actually they affirmatively wanted this guy to be released or it's incompetence, it doesn't lessen how disgusting it is that this person was included in the 1,500 who received pardons.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of the point, is that if you look at some of the people who they do pardon and who they don't, I just can't get over that the very first person is his own son. It's all about him. Then it's about the people who work for him. Then it's about rich donors or, all these other people who've got strings and all these other things. And then eventually maybe we'll get to the people who have no power whatsoever. But that's the story. That is literally the story of pardons. I think the whole thing is completely crazy.
He's a very selfish individual.
Yeah. He's one of the most selfish men to ever occupy the Oval Office, which sounds crazy, but it is. If you look at the decisions, every single one of them is true. The most important decision he ever had to make was whether he was going to run again, which requires self-knowledge. And he literally, in his own words, decided to doom the country to fascism, according to him, to salvage his own ego. I literally cannot think of a more selfish act.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.